Welcome everyone to this event to launch our recent report, The Future of Carbon Pricing, and that is what we're going to discuss today. I am lead author of the report for Policy Exchange, and I'd like to thank my co-authors, Joshua Burke, who's here, Michael Taylor, and Warwick Lightfoot. Great turnout today, and I think it's a very topical subject with the IPCC's report on Monday. And I was very disappointed on Monday to narrowly miss out on the Nobel Prize for Economics to William Nordhaus, but next year, Bill. And of course, the government soon has to make a decision on what to do when we leave the EU with relation to emissions trading or a carbon tax. What I would like to say is I am not advocating to leave the EU's emissions trading scheme, but all indication I have heard, or most of the indication I have heard, is that it will be politically difficult to stay in. So our report have looked at what could we do if we decide to leave the EU emissions trading scheme, and we have looked at the option of an independent British carbon tax. This has long been a staple of Policy Exchange energy policy. Going back as far as 2010, we have a good relationship with Professor Dieter Helm, and he wrote a report for us called The Case for a Carbon Tax, where he outlined how a carbon tax would work and made the case for so-called border carbon adjustments, which means taxing emissions based on consumption in this country rather than on production, which is how it is predominantly measured. So Dieter, as you know, has been banging this drum for a long time, and it was also in the recent government review on energy costs, where he also made the case for a carbon tax with border carbon adjustments. So because of our interest in this field, we last year partnered with the American organization, the Climate Leadership Council, and their founder and CEO, Ted Halstead, is here today, and we'll hear from him and what's been going on in America a little later. And then we'll go into a panel discussion, and we're delighted to have Alyssa Gilbert, the Director of Policy and Translation from the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment at Imperial College, and Michael Grubb, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at University College London. But we're delighted also to have two heavyweight political speakers here, in Lord Darling, who we'll hear from in a few minutes. But first up, we will have Michael Howard, former Secretary for the Environment and obviously Leader of the Opposition. We're following Lord Howard's comments on climate change recently, where he successfully placed an article on climate change in the Daily Mail, which was a great success, where he said, "Claims that combating climate change would ruin our economy have conclusively been disproved. We are both richer and greener than a generation ago. The events of this summer," meaning the heat wave across the Northern Hemisphere, "should spur us to continue cutting our own greenhouse gas emissions and persuade other nations to do better." Lord Howard, I welcome you to the stage.
Well, thank you very much. And I suppose I must begin by congratulating Policy Exchange on the timing of this event. It is quite extraordinary. As you've already heard, we had the report of the Intergovernmental Panel at the beginning of the week. We've had the announcement this morning of the ExxonMobil $1 million contribution to funding research on carbon pricing, and the absolute supreme plaudit of all, I heard on Radio 4 this morning that tonight's edition of the Moral Maze, no less, is going to be devoted to a discussion of this subject. So the timing of Policy Exchange has been truly remarkable. The panel report, which came out at the beginning of the week, was a very significant milestone in what, for me personally, has been quite a long journey. Immediately after the 1992 general election, John Major appointed me Secretary of State for the Environment, and the first thing that I had to do was to go to Washington to persuade the administration of George Bush Sr. to sign the Climate Change Convention, the forerunner, the first international agreement on climate change, which was to be sealed, signed, and delivered at the Earth Summit in Rio, which was then just a very few weeks away. And it was very uncertain as to whether the administration would sign the Climate Change Convention. They were certainly not going to sign the other convention, which was up for discussion at the Earth Summit, which was the Biodiversity Convention. And it was understood that if they didn't sign the Climate Change Convention, Bush wouldn't go to Rio, and the whole significance of the Earth Summit would have been significantly undermined. And it was in many ways the most interesting day in my entire ministerial career. I spent the day in Washington. I visited several heads of departments, political heads of departments, the Energy Secretary, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Interior Secretary, and others. They were completely disagreed. They disagreed completely with each other as to whether the administration should sign the convention. The only thing they could agree on was that whether or not they signed depended entirely on the meeting which I was to hold at the State Department at the end of the day. So there was no pressure. And I went to the State Department and I sat down with a gentleman who was then number 3 in the State Department called Bob Zellick, who later became president of the World Bank. We went through the convention's draft line by line, changing a little bit here, putting a comma in there, a parenthesis in here, and so on. And in the end, he said, I think we've got it. And I went along to the White House. I saw Brent Scowcroft, who was, I think, at that time, Chief of Staff to the President. And he said, if Bob thinks it's okay, I'm sure the President will too. I went straight from there to Dulles Airport. I flew back, and the first thing that happened when I got into the office in the morning was that Bob Zellick was on the phone. He said, the President wants a change. And I said, what's the change? And he told me, and I said, you can't have that change. The Europeans wouldn't wear it, and you can't have that change. And he said, I knew you'd say that. It'll be all right. And it was all right. And the Americans signed the convention, and President Bush went to Rio. We have come a long way since then. And in many ways, the United Kingdom is ahead of the pack. We have achieved a 40% reduction in our carbon emissions compared to 1990 levels. And one of the many things which have contributed to that is the extent to which we have introduced carbon pricing. It is a mechanism for achieving emission reduction which consists of effectively intervening in the market and harnessing market forces to achieve your objective. And as an old-fashioned free marketeer, you would expect me to be wholly in favour of that approach, as opposed to regulation. Regulation has its place, of course, and sometimes regulation is necessary. But if you can harness market forces to achieve your objective, I think you are much more likely to succeed. But the question is, what do we do now? And the report of the panel at the beginning of the week reminded us that collectively the world has to do much more if we are to avoid the very serious consequences which it outlines. Indeed, the report, your report, is focused on a 2% increase in carbon emissions, limiting the emissions to a 2% increase, whereas the panel report says that's not good enough and we have to aim at a 1.5% increase on emissions. So it is clear that very much more needs to be done. But I think it is also clear that carbon pricing has a very important role to play. And as has been said, we face the task, in all probability, of replacing the European emissions trading scheme as we leave the European Union with a scheme of our own. And the report makes two interesting suggestions of ways in which we can take that forward, both of which I think have considerable promise and will, I hope, be taken seriously. The first, again, has been mentioned, is the border tax, which can be levied and could and probably should be levied on products which have been produced by the use of carbon emissions in a process which has involved substantial carbon emissions, but which come from countries which don't themselves have effective carbon pricing or any other means of reducing their emissions. If we don't do something like that, then the obvious danger, is that we export our carbon emissions. Instead of producing emissions ourselves, we buy goods from other countries which have fewer controls, and in terms of dealing with the global problem, we're not making much of an impact. So that is something which needs to be addressed. It is a fair point that many of these countries, including China, for example, are considering the imposition of their own carbon pricing. And I suppose if other countries do introduce carbon pricing themselves, the need for a border tax becomes less pressing. But we're a long way from universal carbon pricing, and so I think a border mechanism would have a part to play. The other very interesting suggestion in the policy exchange report, it may not have quite as much appeal to Alyssa as an ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer as I think it may have to others, is that when you've collected the tax, you distribute it out again as a dividend to your citizens. And clearly that would make the tax a good deal more popular, or at least less unpopular, than it would otherwise be. And so there is no reason in principle why you couldn't have a revenue neutral carbon tax. Which would achieve the environmental objectives that you want to achieve without some of the unpopularity and adverse consequences which taxes can sometimes have. So I commend the policy exchange report. I think it is a really interesting and significant contribution to policy discussion in this field. And I hope that its recommendations get taken very seriously by government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Howard. So one of the things with the carbon tax, one of the downsides to point out of a carbon tax is that people say it's not bankable. You need some business needs some credibility to buy into the idea that the Chancellor of the day will not come and say, no, I'm taking that away. It's too expensive for business. We're not going to have that anymore. Like the price floor was frozen for many years now. So how do you fix that? Well, there are various ways to do it, and we've looked into it in the report, but one thing that is a bedrock of that is cross-party support. And we're very lucky in the UK to have had cross-party support for over a decade now on action on climate change. And just last month, we had an event to celebrate 10 years since the passing of the Climate Change Act, where we had Minister Claire Perry, we had Ed Miliband, and we had Lynn Featherstone from the Liberal Democrats. And it was almost a love-in. It was so boring. They were just agreeing with each other that we needed to do more. But that is one of the things you need to get a tax going. And Alistair Darling, Lord Darling, has been talking about climate change since when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he was leading the fight at the G20. And I saw a quote from him saying, we either take action and stop these problems happening, or we fail to take action and we face bigger costs down the line. My message to my fellow finance minister is there's a job of work to be done here, and I don't think anyone seriously denies there's a problem. Let's get on with it. Well, the extent to which we've gotten on with it in the last 10 years, I'm not sure. We've made some progress, but we need to make more. But with that, I invite Lord Darling to the stage.
Thank you very much for your introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm very happy to follow Michael Howard. I think one of the things that is recognised, certainly in this country, and I imagine in most countries, is that if you want to do anything constructive and meaningful about tackling climate change and reducing carbon, you need a political consensus, because the timescales over which you operate in most countries will mean that you have governments of different political colours, different persuasions, and you've got to maintain that. Like Michael Howard, I was also responsible for the UK's energy policy, albeit for a much shorter period in 2006, some 12 years ago. I can't claim that my term as the Minister responsible for energy was the most dramatic in my political life. I kept that for the next job. But I very much welcome this report because, frankly, I do think we need some fresh thinking as to how we continue the work that has been started. But I think we must acknowledge before we get to that that it would be a mistake to assume that we haven't done that much in the last 20 years, because we have. Our emissions have fallen dramatically, 40%, as Michael Howard said, and power some 62% reduction of emissions, because successive governments since the 1990s have followed a policy of introducing measures to reduce carbon emissions, to encourage new technology. In particular, if you look at what can now be done with wind and with solar energy, it would have been unimaginable 25 years ago. The Climate Change Act, introduced in 2008, has been accepted by all the political parties. It's been added to in various ways. So therefore, we can look back at the last 25 years and acknowledge that changes have been made. But I think all of us would equally say that reforms are necessary, regardless of Brexit. Even if Brexit wasn't happening, there would be a very strong case for making reforms and looking at the way in which we continue the drive to reduce carbon emissions, not just here, but elsewhere as well. And just looking at where we are at the moment, one of the things that is very striking about the mechanisms that we use in the United Kingdom is just how complex they are, how overlapping they are, how opaque they are, particularly with regard to the costs. One of the things that people will say in relation to a carbon tax is, yes, but it will cost. But at the moment, the policy measures introduced by successive governments are costing. It's just that it's terribly difficult to see them. And you will see that when you read this report. The authors make the point that the opacity of the costs is a problem that we need to deal with. I'd also commend to you the House of Lords Economic Committee, on which I sit, its report into the price of energy, which was published last year, which makes exactly the same point. That this is something that we ought to pursue, but the whole thing is extremely complex and difficult to understand. And in my experience, when you get policies like that, sooner or later, they will run into difficulties. I think the other thing I would just observe in passing, and this is a UK point, that when it was striking that certainly taking part in the House of Lords Economic Committee examination of the electricity market, this is no normal market. It is not like a market for cars or soap powder. This market is very heavily regulated. What is required is in relation to security supply, affordability, and the need for greener energy is very heavily regulated. And ultimately, it's a responsibility of the government, and it's something that needs to be looked at. But as a first step, I think we should look at the way in which we deal with the price of carbon, which I think most of us would accept has to be tackled. And the attraction for me for a carbon tax, it is much simpler and is more transparent than other mechanisms. Now, let me say it before other people do. There's no doubt that ex-chancellors are much more courageous, as Yes Minister would say, than those who are in office. And once you've left office, it's much easier, therefore, to stand back and look objectively at what might be good for the country in the long term. I don't for a moment argue that it would be easy to do this because, frankly, the arguments are not being made at the moment. But I believe that the value of this paper published by the Policy Exchange is that we do need to think about something that is simpler, more transparent, so we can see what we're actually doing. It would mean that you could get rid of some of the more cumbersome and complex regulations that would not be necessary if you had this system. And that, to my mind, is something that is very important. But equally important is the idea that there should be a dividend for people who would actually be paying the tax. Now, it is a fact, I think, that those who are better off, generally speaking, have a bigger carbon footprint than those who are on low incomes. And the problem is that if you simply have a tax and you don't have any form of rebate or any form of reward, is that the people who are paying more are the people who are paying more at the moment, the very people on low incomes who are least able to do that. Which is why I think the more work clearly needs to be done to develop this. But the idea of saying, yes, there's going to be a carbon tax so that we can reduce the volume of carbon emissions, we can see what we're doing far more clearly, but it's got to be matched by a reduction in the amount at the end of the day that people, particularly on low incomes, are paying. And that is why the two things go very much together. The second thing that I think appeals is the fact that there is clearly some degree of momentum internationally to do the same or similar things in other countries as well. I welcome what's being developed in the United States at the moment, but also elsewhere as well. When you bear in mind that something like 85% of global emissions are not covered by schemes, there's an awful lot more work to be done in every part of the world. And the risk of offshoring the problem, whereby we do things here and say, aren't we doing well? But all we've done is simply move the generation and carbon generation offshore, is something that clearly needs to be tackled as well. Michael Howard mentioned the interconnectors. Well, there's two things I would say about that. I very much hope that whatever else happens in Brexit, there is some agreement on the interconnectors, because we rely on them very heavily to get electricity, especially at certain times of year. But also, it would be a ridiculous situation to get ourselves into, whereby we import electricity that's been generated by carbon producing generation, but we say our emissions have not gone up, because it wasn't actually generated within the territory of the United Kingdom. So it clearly needs to be looked at. As I say, whether or not we had Brexit is something that needs to be looked at. The last thing I wanted to say is the importance of a political consensus, not just domestically, which I think there largely is in this country, but you can't be complacent about that, but also internationally too. We have come a long way from Michael Howard's trip to speak to George W. Bush Sr. The present incumbent of the White House, I think, takes a slightly different view of these matters, but this is something we quite clearly need to build on. Monday's report was a reminder that we have achieved a great deal, but in some ways we're still in the foothills of the battle to reduce carbon emissions and tackle climate change, and that work needs to be redoubled. And I very much hope that in the United Kingdom the argument doesn't over the next few years simply get tied down on whether or not who should be owning the production of electricity and so on. I've said what I think about the present market system, that it's not working, but it's not just affordability that's an issue, it's also the question of security of supply and also the question of carbon reduction. So the reason I welcome this, as I say, is it's simpler, it's more transparent. More work has to be done on how actually there would be a dividend and how that people can share in the rewards of reducing carbon emissions. And we do need to do far more to build a consensus. We can't be complacent about this. This is a growing problem. It's going to be economically damaging. It's going to be socially damaging if we don't deal with it. The prize is great. And that's why this report is well worth welcoming and well worth doing a lot more work on and see if we can't move things forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Lord Howard. That was a great case made for border carbon adjustments and for preventing offshoring of emissions. And he talked about the international aspect of carbon taxes. And I would also like to say that Emmanuel Macron has come out in favour of border carbon adjustments many times. So I think whatever happens to the UK at an EU level, the EU should consider both a carbon price floor and border carbon adjustments on goods. So now we'd like to move to America, where, of course, they have complete political consensus as well. Everything's going great. But Ted Halstead, founder and CEO of the Climate Leadership Council, despite the political differences in America, has done a great job in uniting progressive Democrats all the way to Reagan Republicans to get behind their carbon dividends plan in the US. Ted?
Thank you, Matthew. It's an honor to be here. I've long been impressed by the quality of research and thinking at Policy Exchange, so it's been great to partner on this, and I want to commend Matthew, Josh, Michael, and Warwick for a really superb report. It's also an honor to follow such distinguished statesmen who spoke very eloquently about the UK political context, so I will confine myself to the US political context. Now, I understand that there is a bit of pessimism with our current president in a sense that the United States as a whole is backtracking on climate policy, but I'm here to provide a voice of optimism because there is actually a great deal of encouraging developments underway in the United States. Let me whet your appetite with, by highlighting three key developments. First, the broadest climate coalition in US history has come together around a new national solution. Second of all, that national solution would far exceed the US commitment under the Paris Agreement and actually be based on what would be, in effect, the highest carbon price of any leading emitter country. And just in the last 24 hours, we got additional wind in our sails, where it's been widely reported that ExxonMobil contributed $1 million. And I want to be clear, this isn't just to a carbon tax in generic terms. It is to a very concrete carbon dividends plan, which I will tell you about more in a moment. So with those highlights, let me step back for a moment and talk about how we got to the stage and where this is going. So first of all, the effort began with an intent to bring the unusual suspects to the table, meaning Republicans and leading businesses. So our version of this idea was introduced by a who's who of Republican senior statesmen: George Shultz, James Baker, Hank Paulson, Marty Felsen and Greg Mankiw, the two most respected conservative economists in the country. We co-authored this plan and introduced it 2 weeks into the Trump administration. It got a tremendous amount of coverage at the time. The plan is based on 4 pillars, and although it is a distinctly conservative plan based on free markets and limited government, it is meant to be a plan where all sides can win. So of course the first pillar is a carbon tax starting at $40 a ton, which is quite significant. The second pillar, as in the case of this report, is a dividend. And I want to emphasize the political importance of that because I think it's little appreciated that the reason that carbon pricing has been so limited for so long is because of what I like to discuss as a psychological barrier. I mean, basically, advocates are encouraging fellow citizens to make short-term sacrifices now for the benefits of other people in other countries 30 or 40 years in the future. It just runs contrary to human nature, and that is why it has been such an uphill battle. The dividend idea transforms that, remessages that. In America, the data shows that 70% of American households, including the most vulnerable, would win. The plan is deeply popular. The plan would make the system lasting because it would create a hook, which would prevent it from being undone. And George Shultz and I have a new report called The Dividend Advantage coming out this Friday, and we make 10 arguments why the dividend offers the most popular, equitable, and politically viable climate solution. The final argument is that it closes Pandora's box. In the US context, if you ask Republicans and Democrats how they might use carbon tax revenue, if not on a dividend, well, of course, Republicans would say corporate tax reduction, paying down the deficit. Democrats would say, well, let's invest in green energy or in helping low-income households or in climate adaptation. These two sides shall never meet. The dividend provides a common denominator. The third pillar of our plan, which I should say is quite distinct from or different in context than the UK, is a very fundamental, what we call regulatory simplification, and distinct simply because it's based on the US context, and the context in the UK is quite different. But in essence, the plan is based on a grand bargain. Trade a robust and growing carbon tax for a phase-out repeal of all carbon regulations where a market signal would be more cost effective. Now, this is what appeals to businesses and to conservatives because it gives us an opportunity to have lower emissions with a smaller government. And what justifies this? We put out a report last month called Exceeding Paris, and it shows that our plan, this is modeled by top econometric firms in the country, several in fact, shows that our plan would achieve 32% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2025. That's assuming it's implemented in 2021. And to give you the comparisons, the analysis shows that if you follow Trump-era policies now, you get to 14% reduction. If you followed all Obama-era climate regulations, had they remained in place, you would get to 18% reductions. If you follow the recently announced bottom-up efforts that we are still in and America's pledge efforts in the United States, which are a very promising development, they find that would get to about 17% reduction by 2025. The Paris goal is 28% in the United States. Our plan would exceed that by a significant margin. And on top of that, to guarantee this winning trade and encourage the other side to be willing to relinquish those regulations, we would add what we call an environmental assurance mechanism. Simply put, if we fail to reach intended emissions reductions, the carbon tax rate would grow even faster. The fourth pillar of our plan, identical, a border carbon adjustment, which I'm sure we'll talk about in Q&A, but I do want to emphasize that that is based on a whole different theory of how to get to a global price on carbon, not through international negotiations, but through a country or region operating unilaterally with a border carbon adjustment, which starts a domino effect. So with that as background, let me quickly go through the milestones of what we've achieved and what we're going towards in the United States. So the first thing, in June of last year, we announced the founding members of the Climate Leadership Council, a group that has since expanded significantly. This is the broadest climate coalition in U.S. history to push a national plan. And I want to emphasize for this setting that although we have 4 of the oil majors, super majors in our group, which is Exxon, BP, Shell, and Total, just to be very clear, they are signing on to a U.S. plan, and one should not interpret that to necessarily be support in other countries. So I want to bracket that. But the coalition ranges from the oil majors to the largest utility, the largest car manufacturer in the United States, to the largest solar company, to the largest insurers, the largest food and beverage companies, household products companies, building companies, and so forth. Then on the individual side, it ranges from Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, and Larry Summers, and the late Stephen Hawking, who actually I met with early on in the project and asked specifically, how would you deal with the unbanked, which I thought was a very insightful question, and we do have an answer to that. So it's a very broad coalition which gives legitimacy to this effort. Next milestone in our effort, we launched a separate, what in the United States is called the C4, an advocacy lobbying organization. It is called Americans for Carbon Dividends. It is co-chaired by former Republican Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott and former Senator John Breaux. It is pushing this plan on the Hill through member-to-member meetings, lining up co-sponsors so that this plan can be introduced mid-next year. And the $1 million that Exxon just invested, just committed, announced yesterday, is into Americans for Carbon Dividends, that lobbying arm, which has just started in June and already has a multi-million-dollar budget. The largest utility in the United States, the largest solar company, and wind industries have also supported. So this new lobbying effort already has financial support from oil, natural gas, wind, solar, and nuclear power, which is a encouraging start. We've also launched there's a separate organization called Students for Carbon Dividends that was co-founded by 23 college Republican groups in the United States, which is interesting because we have the Republican elder statesmen, the next generation of Republicans, all trying to push the current generation of Republicans. The polling, which we've just done, is interesting. Most interesting of all is 3-to-1 support for a carbon dividends plan among Republicans and Trump supporters, which gives you a sense of the political potential. 4-to-1 support among millennials, which is, of course, the next generation, that is soon to be the largest cohort of Americans. We see the timeline as introducing this plan on a bipartisan basis in the next Congress, meaning somewhere in 2019, with passage somewhere in early 2021. That is the default assumption that we are operating under. So in conclusion, I just want to say that in the U.S. context, there are significant tipping points and turning points that I think cause room for optimism. First, as we've seen with the Exxon announcement, there's a real course change within the oil majors who are taking a more proactive stance in backing serious climate policy solutions at the national level. Second of all, I think most interesting is that businesses in America are the ones leading the way. There was overwhelming business support for staying in the Paris Agreement. Given that that is not the case, companies are taking it upon themselves to lead in pushing for a national climate solution. And on Capitol Hill, that has a very big influence. And finally, I think it's clear that there's increasing pressure on the Republican Party to come forth with a proactive climate solution of their own. We believe that this is it. And interestingly, there is a splintering of the GOP base along demographic lines on the climate issue, and no party can be the party of the future without a base of younger voters. So, final remark, from our perspective, being the American optimists, we believe that it is not a question of whether a grand bipartisan bargain of this type will be struck, but rather when. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted. Very persuasive argument. I was especially impressed that he got Professor Stephen Hawking to sign up to the plan, because he was a neighbour of mine when he studied at Darwin College, Cambridge, which was very exciting for me. We've heard from the political world. In a few minutes, we'll go to the political world, to the academic world, but first I'm just going to set out the main arguments and policies we're proposing in the report, which I'm sure you've all read cover to cover. We got a little bit carried away with the 80 pages. But very simply, if we were going to leave the EU ETS and set up an independent carbon tax, the first thing to do would be to leave the EU ETS, and I think there's broad agreement that the logical time to do so would be after the third trading period, which would be the beginning of 2021. We would recommend that you set the carbon tax at the level of the UK's total carbon tax at the time, which would be the EU ETS price plus the carbon price support mechanism, and that would reduce disruption to business. We recommend that the Committee on Climate Change would set the trajectory of the rate. Again, that would be controversial for government, who would be losing a little bit of control, but we think to have a bit of political independence in setting the level of the tax going forward would help to give credibility to business. And after that, so that would be day one, then you would begin, we don't believe you could do all our plan from day one, but you would begin to expand the tax to cover different parts of the economy. So you'd set up a cross-departmental body to look into how the tax can be expanded to cover all sections of the economy, whilst in the same time rolling out border carbon adjustments. And a lot of people have said, this is an ivory tower, pie in the sky thing that Professor Dieter Helm pushes, but it's gaining real political traction. And even the most simple, I heard the most simple border carbon adjustment this week, which was from President Macron, who said, we won't do trade deals with countries that are not signed up to the Paris Agreement. So that's sort of the most basic sort of border carbon adjustment you could imagine. Revenue recycling, of course, others have said it turns a regressive tax into progressive policy, but we would also want to look into ways to ensure that the poorest get it, so how you would pay maybe through a mobile app or something to ensure the poorest get it, because through a traditional benefits system, often the poorest and the most in need miss out. We're big fans of the Climate Change Act, as I think almost everyone is, and we would retain the Climate Change Act, but strengthen it, and lots of people say it needs to look more at consumption, as has been said before. And to address two criticisms of a carbon tax and this sort of plan, often they say, well, why would you spend the money on a dividend? Why would you not spend it on efficiency? But we had the idea to allow citizens to borrow against their future dividend to spend on efficiency measures, and of course the government should continue to spend on efficiency measures as well, because it's called the low-hanging fruit. You don't need a carbon tax to fund many of these things, but people don't do it because of various barriers. And on the second point, we recognise that the carbon tax is not the only solution, and so we would support government intervention to fund things like carbon capture and storage, and maybe my bugbear, small modular nuclear reactors, which won't get going without some sort of government intervention or innovation funding. Even smart grids and things like this, the government needs to intervene. And with that, I would like to introduce our academics. So Alyssa, Gilbert, if you'd like to go first and tell us about the future of carbon taxes.
Great, thanks. Michael, we make sure we leave something for you to say at the end. Thanks. At the moment, I work on quite a broad range of policies, but for my sins, I spent about 12 years as being a carbon pricing expert and doing a lot of work on these issues. I wanted to start, as many of the other speakers did, by referring to the IPCC report that was presented earlier this week. I think it's impossible to overestimate the scale of the challenge. The report on Monday reminded us, first of all, that maintaining global temperature rises to 2 degrees C is significantly worse than 1.5 degrees C on every metric imaginable: biodiversity, sea level rise, sea ice. So we need to try our best to stay within 1.5 if we can. To do that, our carbon budget runs out in 12 years. 12 years. Lord Howard started by talking about his conversations with George Bush in 1992. Okay, that was more than 12 years ago. Okay, 12 years, this is urgent. What does that mean we actually need to do? It means we actually have to use every single emissions reduction tool that we have now, everywhere in the world. Now, from tomorrow. Okay? That is the scale of what we're talking about. If we don't do that, which admittedly is tricky, okay, when we think about countries that don't have the support, the cross-party support that we have politically, countries that aren't economically strong than ours, let's say we don't do that, we can't afford to give up because the emissions will keep growing and growing. So we'll go from 1.5 to 2 degrees to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8. So this is what we're dealing with. We need to put policies in place to stimulate everything as quickly as possible. Why is carbon pricing important? Because we do want to do so as cost effectively as possible and as cheaply as possible. And I think to some extent there may be a little bit of a tension, I would argue, sometimes between the speed that we need and genuinely doing everything in the most cost-effective way. So one comment I would make is that we mustn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So let's recognize where we can make more rapid action and maybe acknowledge ourselves when we talk about policy. Many of us are deep policy experts, that we can't always have the perfect thing. That doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for the perfect thing. So that's the bigger picture. What about the UK so far? What's happened in the UK so far? So we've heard some really interesting stories and pockets of what's happened in the UK so far. Actually, it's great. Really, genuinely. I love working on climate policy in the UK. We have political consensus. That's incredibly vital and important and valuable. We haven't just had it for 10 years. The Climate Change Act was 10 years ago. We've had it for way longer than that. Margaret Thatcher talked about climate change. The Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, which was well over sort of 25 years ago, talked about climate change. We've had this going for a long time in the UK, and it's really vital and allows us to try a lot more different things here, I think, as well. Also, we have a really, really rich history here in carbon pricing. So the things here, and I don't want to sound rude, lots of this isn't new. It's good sometimes to repeat things that aren't new. Some of it is new. Lots of this isn't new. Border carbon adjustments. Dieter Helm, but Michael's been talking about border carbon adjustments for a long time. This isn't new, and that's good, because we have open ears to the idea of using carbon prices in the UK. Let's give some examples. CCL, what does that stand for? Climate Change Levy. We have one. Emissions trading system. The EU emissions trading system was predated by the UK emissions trading system. So we've had our own emissions trading system. So let's not ask the question, post-Brexit, should we do this ourselves? We did it ourselves first, here. In fact, we set up the UK ETS to experiment and see how a better emissions trading system could be shaped. We shaped that, and we can continue to be the people, the country that's shaping things. So I think this report is a helpful way to say, what can we do next? Policy is a continuum, and it's innovating. The UK is a supporter of carbon pricing. How can we take the next step forward in leadership and evolution? I think there's some great ideas here for that. I might remind some of you of the CRC. That was the UK's experiment with taking EU emissions trading system, which works for the bigger emitters, and using a trading approach for smaller companies and organizations. Some of you who may have worked with the then government department trying to develop the CRC might remember the intense complexity of this particular scheme. I think when we talk about taking a policy that works in one sector or for one size, we know that one size doesn't fit all, and I again would caution you to maybe think about how does this policy work for other sectors, remembering that one size doesn't always fit all. So again, a nice place to start in the UK. Many previous speakers spoke about how well we've done on actually emissions reductions in the UK. So not only have our emissions gone down since 1990 very significantly, as referred to, our economy has grown significantly at the same time. Absolutely brilliant success. If you dive into the CCC's most recent progress report in 2017, you'll notice that the sectors that have declined are actually very few sectors. The sectors that have declined in emissions are the power sector, the waste sector, and the industry sector only. Okay? And if you recall what I said at the beginning, the IPCC report reminds us we need everything in every sector, in every country, now in 12 years' time. Okay, so that's the scale of the challenge. And whilst I appreciate the importance of reducing costs and therefore perhaps the need for some deregulation, if we're going to achieve that across all sectors, some things aren't working right now in sectors beyond energy. That's really vital. Okay, so what was the role of carbon pricing? If we see that the power sector reduced its emissions so significantly, that's great, because we know that the power sector and some of heavy industry have been at the heart of where we see carbon prices already in the UK. So has this great decrease? Can we just basically say it's great? Because we had carbon pricing in those sectors and emissions have gone down, so that's a proof point. Let's remember that we didn't only have carbon pricing in those sectors. And I would argue that while carbon pricing has delivered some of those reductions, it hasn't been responsible for all of them. And in fact, some other policies and measures have enabled carbon pricing to be successful. So let me just pick out some examples without being comprehensive. As referred to in your report, absolutely, we have good evidence that the carbon price floor, the UK's unilateral carbon price floor, in addition to the EU ETS, has delivered significant emissions reductions in terms of coal to gas fuel pricing switches. And we saw that actually even before that a price signal really helps with those kind of decisions, switching between different sources. And you could argue that now that we have really, really low renewable prices, then a price signal can do the same thing. And that's true. But how did we get those really low prices for those technologies? Actually, to get there, we had to make some investments. If you'd have asked anyone who worked in energy, this is a really risky thing to say. Okay, so pretend I didn't say that. But 10 years ago, if you'd have said that we'd have investable prices in offshore wind, what would people have said? Offshore wind was impossibly expensive. It's become cheaper not because of a carbon price signal, or certainly not because of a carbon price signal alone. It's been a combination of other investments that's brought down the cost of offshore wind and removed other non-price barriers, as well as created an industry and moved people from jobs in oil and gas to jobs of offshore wind that's enabled now a carbon price signal to incentivize more offshore wind. So some of these policies work together. We also know, and you referred to energy efficiency support, and you referred to that in the document as well, that we know that in some places there's a plethora of other barriers that stop people in investing, particularly in energy efficiency, both domestically but also sometimes in businesses as well, even though it makes sense. Making upfront decisions for high capital investment, even though it pays off over the long term, can be very difficult for a variety of reasons. So carbon pricing is important in the power sector. Let's remember, and I was asked the question, talk about is carbon pricing important in the energy sector? One of the hardest nuts to crack right now is heating. In the UK, and one of the proposals is heat pumps in terms of technology. Another proposal is to electrify all of heat. And that would enormously increase, by multiples, the amount of electricity generating capacity we need here. Okay, so could carbon price deliver the changes that we want in heat in that part of the energy sector? Building on what I just said, actually, we need some enablers, particularly infrastructure, to help pricing be that signal for people to be able to make that decision. So carbon pricing, I would say, has a role, but we need some investment in infrastructure and tackling other behavior change. One, of course, that's also important to mention is an enabling planning environment. So we have seen, I think very unfortunately, an outright ban on onshore wind investment in England, but that's actually one of the cheapest ways to achieve carbon reductions. So what are you saying? If you're going to say a carbon price signal for cost-effective approaches, but you're going to put in the way other barriers, that doesn't seem like a very market-friendly approach. And finally, I would mention that you need certainty for financing. So when people are making investments in renewables, cost is an issue, but sometimes it's the certainty of the revenue that's important to enable project developers to borrow money at an affordable price. Cost of capital is a real barrier to renewables investors. that certainty that they need to have an affordable cost of capital comes not only from low price of the initial investment, but some guarantee over wholesale prices, for example, which are hard to get. So those kind of certainties aren't achieved through a carbon price. So it's a mix. It's important. It's not the whole story. It is crucial, though, carbon pricing. I don't want you to get me wrong. Carbon pricing is important because at the moment we have a complete imbalance in the way we see costs. The environmental cost is completely missing from any kind of price signal of anything we do, where there isn't a carbon price. So it is actually vital to have it there. So what more do we need to decarbonize in the UK and abroad? There are some really tricky sectors. So I mentioned within energy we have heat is really hard. Arguably, you could say that power is solved. If it wasn't for the urgency, the power sector is well on the way. But heat is a real problem. Agriculture, tricky. Aviation is a nightmare because use of aviation is growing. We don't have many good solutions. Carbon capture and storage needs investment along the storage way. And we need, in some cases, we actually do really need more R&D. We need some more technology in some places, but let's not wait for the silver bullet. We actually need to make more of what we've got now. So I'm going to finish. He's thinking, thankfully, she's going to finish. So I'm going to finish with a more broader international reflection. And I think this links nicely with how Ted finished on border carbon adjustments. If we think about political feasibility overall in the world, we've changed the approach at the international level from something that looks really top-down to something that's more bottom-up, where every country devises its own climate change targets in a way that fits its cultural and political context and its economy. I think that's the same way we need to see carbon pricing. We actually need to see a proliferation of carbon pricing. We're already seeing that. Over 40 countries and jurisdictions have carbon prices. And the way in which you choose which carbon price should fit your local circumstance. And over time, we should come up, bring that carbon price up, and seek convergence from a bottom-up kind of, in a bottom-up kind of way. You know, I was lucky enough to go to Washington State a few years ago, and I met with Governor Inslee then, and he actually asked me, this was during my complete carbon pricing wonk kind of days, and he said to me, what should I do in Washington? Should I have a tax or should I have a trading scheme? And actually, despite having devoted many years of my life to the very finer details of a trading scheme, I said, just do what people will vote for. Whichever one is politically acceptable, you can make it work. And I would say that the same is true here. So this dividend part of this is actually really important in that regard. So I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to further conversation.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'll just make sure that you will have time for questions at the end, and our final speaker is Professor Michael Grubb, and by way of apology for having one of the most eminent energy academics in the world come last, I'll give a plug to his book, which academics always love, Planetary Economics, available in all bookstores now. It's a fantastic read. Michael.
Thank you. Quite right, I'm happy now. Stop. I have one sort of iron rule, I think, for think tank reports that I'd like to suggest, and which I recall and learnt in my days at Chatham House, I confess, more than 20 years ago, what a thought that is, when I took a piece to our review committee, which said, oh, this is going to be hard, that's going to be hard, this is going to be really tricky, this is true. We should consider emissions trading. And people said, that's crazy. People won't do that. Chatham House is supposed to be a serious institution. And my dear boss and chair said, well, what other ideas have people got? Can we walk through? And there was a long silence. And he said, right, well, I don't see why we shouldn't publish that. So my iron rule is, if people are saying that you're saying something, this is crazy, it won't be done, that must mean it's really worth saying. And I think this report is absolutely in that terrain. So first of all, congratulations. I really enjoy looking at it. You posed us a number of questions, and I want to kind of try and wrap them all broadly around the umbrella topic of what might I consider, from a fairly long history in this area, sort of principles of carbon pricing. And other speakers have covered a lot of things. I'll try not to repeat too much, but I'll put it in four areas, I think. The first may sound a bit strange, which is, I think the first principle should be impact. Why do I say that? Because isn't it obvious? Well, One thing I eventually learned after a while is one of the reasons we were having such a struggle around environmental pricing is because to the environmental people, the purpose of environmental pricing is obvious. It's to change behaviour. It's to reduce the environmental damaging. Actually, every decent tax economist in the Treasury is taught that the definition of a good tax is something that raises money without changing behaviour. So you kind of had these dialogues that were sort of floating past each other. So I think it has to be nailed that actually the reason to tax this rather than some other things is because there is a wider goal of public good already well signed up, political consensus, and it is a very efficient instrument for changing things. What flows from that is an immediate question, okay, so what is it you're trying to change? What we've had in the UK and Europe, but particularly the UK, as I think Alyssa stressed, is a combination of instruments in which the carbon pricing was a crucial component, but not the total driver, of massively impressive improvements in the power sector. Because we'd had efficiency, which helped to keep demand down, and we'd had the renewables program that squeezed the space, and the carbon price could then flip the coal onto much cleaner gas. That was broadly an operational decision. The challenge for carbon pricing now is going to be, will it affect investment? That is what the EU ETS has really failed to do because of repeated price collapses and instability. So first of all, I think you're right, spot on, to say if this instrument is supposed to take the place of some of the other instruments as part of the purpose of regulatory simplification, it absolutely needs longevity and credibility. Sufficient that actually investors will be willing to go to their boards and say, I want £1 billion because this is going to happen to the carbon price, which they have been completely unable to do to date. So I think absolutely congratulations on that. A second area, I mean, I'll avoid the temptation to comment on the electricity market reform. I think broadly has been successful, but like many successes, it's going to have to keep moving because actually it does need to be developed, shall I say, substantially during the 2020s, in part to facilitate a carbon price having a real impact on investment decisions. It's not a simple matter of just saying, hey, we've got a short-run market in electrons and there'll be a future carbon price. They don't quite hang together enough that simply. But I won't go into the details on that one. But I think the second area I'd like to say is beyond electricity, we have to be thinking about the carbon price in the context of an industrial strategy. Now, my own view is that effective strategy tends to involve three pillars of actions. You know my stuff, and sort of laid out in the book is that there is stuff around efficiency and behaviour and sort of personal and consumer choice. There's the pillar around markets and pricing, and there's a pillar around strategic transformation. And I think that we in the UK have struggled a little bit about the latter. I think it would be great if a carbon price could take more of the strain. I don't think it can take all of the strain, as you've alluded to with respect to, for example, nuclear. But it's also a matter of its interactions with the industries and what kinds of investments are they going to make in the face of this and why. And it's here I think carbon price of the right form really can come into play. I was really struck at a conference about a year and a half, the chief executive of Holcim Lafarge, which may I think now be the world's biggest cement company outside of China. He said, guys, people don't seem to realise we know how to make zero carbon cement. Our laboratories, we could do it. But why would we bother? There is absolutely no incentive for us to do so. The EU ETS has basically handed out free allocations left, right and centre to anything that has, and to the more you emitted, the more free allowances you got. So actually, and this remains only very partially addressed in the EU ETS, if the UK left EU ETS, which has many cons but some pros. One of the pros is we could take a fresh look at the industrial strategy, the industrial treatment. The other feature, I think, to link it, and this is cautious here, it requires government sophistication, but I was certainly struck again a few years ago talking to a senior executive from Tata Chorus. So why aren't you getting into the steel manufacturing for offshore for wind turbines? And he said, oh no, ThyssenKrupp have got that sewn up. They've been doing it for years. I thought, well, that's one of our problems. If we're serious about this, we need to think about the materials requirement of a low carbon economy and tremendous potential for innovation in low carbon materials, which will be all the stronger if you have the right kind of carbon price that is extended into the industrial sector. But to make that feasible, you also need to, in my view, to be able to support the emerging technologies that would enable both companies and consumers to move to those technologies in response to the carbon price. As I often say, we got let out of petrol very effectively. Pricing was really important, but only after we got the pumps and the forecourts that enabled people to buy unleaded petrol. Otherwise, there would have simply been a revolution that stopped it. So that then touches me on the third point, which is around the politics and the dividend side of this. I've sort of been scratching my head for quite a while on this, and I'm going to partly flunk the question, but simply by trying to lay out at least what I think the issues are, which is it depends a bit whether you're taking an environmental, an economic, a social or a political perspective on this. So from purely environmental perspective, what you'd want to do is take the revenues and use it for low carbon innovation and efficiency, etc., etc. Develop the innovation, electric vehicles infrastructure, etc. From a pure economics perspective, you might say, well, we've also got some other distorting taxes in our economy. We could reduce those, and that would actually mean that actually there might be at least some, or maybe all of the double dividend that economists have talked about for a long time by basically reducing one tax and reducing another distorting a tax. From a social standpoint, you could take the money and use it for the NHS or something else, or you could try and merge some of those into saying, well, let's have a focused program around poor housing, energy efficiency housing, kill two birds with one stone. But what I think Ted has laid out is, and I agree with the fundamental, what is a good carbon price? As Alyssa said, it's one that you can implement. And fundamentally, we have been stymied by politics again and again and again. We have been very fortunate in the UK. We've got further than almost anywhere else outside of Scandinavia and British Columbia in carbon pricing, but it is still a major constraint. So, I give the same answer. Cap and trade, tax, revenues used for this or that or for dividends, that is beyond my competence. That's a political, fundamental question. If you cannot sort the politics, you cannot have the longevity, you cannot have the stability, you cannot have the impact, you cannot have anything else. So, if dividends is what works in the US, go for it. Would it be the same here? I'm not the one to judge. I think the first couple of speakers would be the ones to judge on that. It's not an essential thing analytically, but politically you have real peer. Finally, the other feature of the politics is, of course, the industrial politics and the carbon leakage. And here I just wanted to sort of draw two minor distinctions. One actually relates to the Nobel Peace Prize, the Nobel Economics Prize given out on Monday to Bill Nordhaus. He echoed and pinned down in his wonderful clarity of analytic clarity what a lot of economists have been saying, which is we ain't going to get global countries all agreeing to do everything, so we've got to get a club of countries. They've got to basically make sure you create what you call a club good, make it worth being part of the club, and his solution to that was to have a club with carbon pricing as the index and border adjustments. Now, his version of border adjustments was VAT tariffs against non-participants. I may as well stand up, notwithstanding Nobel Economics Prize, I totally disagree with that. Anyone who's really interested can drop me an email and send you a link to a debate that we had and where I sort of slightly tackled him on the grounds that, we don't actually usually, create a club by threatening to fine people who don't join it, or if it's NATO invading if they don't join, or et cetera, et cetera. That's a slightly separate issue, but the point is, the difficulty with that is you are immediately bringing the entire world trade regime and issues about discrimination between participants and non-participants, etc., which I think is very thorny and maybe, and this is what terrifies the trading world, the last thing we need in the current context. So I think it's vital to say this border issue is not about that. This is simply about making sure that we as consumers pay for carbon wherever the stuff was made. That's an entirely different proposition. It's entirely compatible with common sense economic logic. I mean, why would you expect more environmentally ambitious regions to punish their own producers in favour of foreign producers? That'd be a nuts way of designing a regime. So I think we do have to bite that bullet and say this is simply about charging for carbon appropriately on the basis of consumption. And then you get a much more interesting debate with WTO. Frankly, well, there's some very senior WTO people, including the US congressman who is chair of the appellate body, who said, yeah, he thinks that should be entirely reasonable. Under WTO, you could basically argue that a globally polluting emission in making a good means that it's not the same good. And that means you don't have any problem legally with WTO. And that could be tested, challenged. But I mean, there's lots of mileage, and frankly, the WTO itself, far from being this beast that's going to stop any country doing anything, is just desperate to keep out of this area. The last thing the World Trade regime needs is to be accused of stopping countries saving the planet. So finally, to wrap this up, when we think it through, yeah, it's worth disentangling a few aspects on this border adjustment dimension. One is electricity. I think there's already pinned down by the early speakers. This is going to be tricky within the ETS. It's probably easier outside to say, hey guys, carbon that comes through wires into the UK has to be charged for the carbon that was emitted. And there are ways that can be done. Probably not perfectly, but it's very important. And actually, I think, since trade with France does not have much of a carbon problem, it is going to be the new interconnector to Germany that would be the real test of this proposition, because Germany does still have significant coal. And then I think you get into the industrial goods trading, where, as I've mentioned, there I think the only thing to add to the technical economics is it's another area where you have to handle the politics very closely. I think we need to sit down and talk with the Chinese. Say, look, we think this is perfectly reasonable economics. You know we have a carbon problem. Let's talk through this way of basically facilitating stronger action. As well as, obviously, if the US proposal succeeds, that is absolutely terrain for close UK-US collaboration on exactly what do those carbon border adjustments look like. And so, yeah, I think on the whole, great report, and congratulations on the meeting as well. Very, very interesting.
I'm going to stand at the podium, because I'm told my mic and Alyssa and Ted are going to join us. I won't hog the discussion because I'm sure you want to ask questions, but I will just ask if Ted would like to respond to anything you've heard before you.
First of all, great presentations by everybody. When Bill Nordhaus accepted his Nobel, he specifically said that I think that the dividend plan is the most, I'm paraphrasing here, but he endorsed the dividend concept, which I think is significant. The other is to follow up on Michael. So we have actually launched a US-China dialogue run by a terrific woman called Taya Smith, who was a deputy to Bob Zellick and Hank Paulson. But we are starting that conversation with Chinese leadership to align around how border carbon adjustments, and especially measuring carbon content, might work in the future circumstances where a BCA is in place.
Okay, well, I would love to have a discussion myself, but I'm going to take questions from the floor for our panel. I'll take two at a time, and if you can say your name and organisation. Lady at the front and gentleman at the very back.
Oh, sorry. Hi. A quick comment and a question.
Your name and...
I'm sorry. Judy Hindley, co-founder of Citizens Climate Lobby. Okay. We have a national network working to promote carbon fee and dividend in this country, and would like to hear from any of you who want to join it. Yeah, quick comment is I was interested in the use of the word enabler, and I would suggest that a dividend is an enabler. And I was particularly interested in the fact that in your report you suggested the possibility that implementing a capacity for borrowing against the dividend for things like home insulation. heating houses is one of those, win-win situations. It doesn't need to be done by government intervention. My other question, though, about your report is, I was struck by the simplicity of the first description I had of the carbon tax and dividend, which was a straightforward tax imposed at source. The fact that it cleaned up this regulatory mess in an instant that was so beautifully clear and transparent and easy to implement, I was surprised that you suggested something that to me sounds much more gradual and specific and messy.
Okay.
Sorry.
Can we go to the back as well, just to take a second question? Very back at the gentleman.
Good morning, or good afternoon, sorry. My name's Sam Bidet. I'm from NGen Technologies. We deal with renewable technology. The question to the panel is that, well, first and foremost, congratulations on everything you said. One of the key points that you pointed out was there is lack of political motivation to necessarily see through changes. One of the things that I would like the panel to consider is the fact that we are not considering the actual true impact of, you're talking about carbon, that's correct, obviously from the point of climate change, but actually the World Health Organization has spoken about the fact that 12.6 million people are dying through pollution. A lot of that is through fossil fuel combustion, which is obviously causing the pollution. So could we potentially actually start bringing health economics into the carbon tax political equation and start saying, well, actually, if we're actually causing sort of cancers, premature deaths due to cofactors caused by pollution, and therefore when governments start looking at actually selling the carbon tax, is actually saying, well, actually, we're also improving health, and therefore there is a health dividend to the economies because of the fact that we're actually not killing our citizens, particularly so in America, if I may talk about in the Republicans. We're in a position that actually, yes, I agree that Mr. Trump and the Republican Party does look at conservative policies, small government, but actually when you're spending far more on healthcare, actually treating your citizens dying through pollution, which is a function of carbon emissions, as in carbon emissions are one of the functions of pollution, carbon. Pollution is one of the functions of fossil fuel being combusted, then it might be worthwhile actually using health economics as well as climate change. Climate change is 50 years ahead. We're killing people today.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much. Just to say that our report, Driving Down Emissions, a year or two ago, focused on emissions from carbon emissions and air pollution that we have here in London, because the two are intrinsically linked, particularly with regard to transport. Would any of the panel like to take that on, Alyssa?
So interesting, this comment that you made at the end about how we can combine lots of different drivers that are all for the public good into the decision making we make about policy centrally. We've been investigating that a little bit, looking at some of these win-wins. I can't remember, maybe Michael or Matt, you mentioned housing. So that's kind of an obvious place to look because that can deliver health benefits and it can also deliver environmental benefits quite clearly, those kind of investments. At the moment, at least most of the structure of the civil service in the UK isn't really set up really well to incentivize policy making in that kind of way because department by department you'd be focused on your own objectives. A good example of where it's worked well cross-departmentally is the Office for Low Emission Vehicles. So that is an office that's jointly set up by DFT and now I guess BEIS, but it basically brings together the energy and the transport dimension. And they've been part of the driving force behind the success of early startup and support for electric vehicles in this country, and also looking at hydrogen vehicles, so in general environmentally friendly vehicles, bringing together the transport dimension. And we're doing more thinking that we should have a few more vehicles like that, particularly around the health, energy, and environment nexus.
Michael, anything to add?
On that latter, there's no question that health co-benefits are a huge driver in the Chinese context, and indeed many of the major emerging economies, where a lot of the local and urban pollution is coal, but increasingly focus shifting and obviously here to urban air pollution. And I think, and again, it's sort of, economics tends to try and divvy up separate issues, tackle one thing at a time, and you could organise systems that way, but actually politics is about building coalitions. And I think it's a matter of then, and incidentally, the economics of transformation are frequently about solving several problems at once with the same kind of structural innovations. And so I think that is absolutely both important politically and economically entirely legitimate, yeah.
Sure. And Ted, in an American context, how fast do you think your plan could be implemented? Do you think I was a bit pessimistic with my remarks in saying this would be a gradual implementation?
So we think this can be passed in 2021, possibly before. We would start right away with the tax at $40. That's 2017 dollars. So by 2021, that'd be $43 per ton. So it would be a fast implementation with a significant escalation rate. Real quickly on the comments. Congratulations to CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm not familiar with you in the UK. In the United States, there are 100,000 members, 300 chapters across the country, all pushing for a dividend plan, which is encouraging. And regarding health, yes, I think that's a good argument. But I mean, what's interesting in the debate, and certainly driving in the United States, is there's the health argument. There's the insurers are getting behind climate action. The real estate interests are getting behind climate action. I mean, it's a growing set of voices all converging in the same directions, which hastens progress. And I would emphasize when George Shultz and Larry Summers wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post on this plan recently, they specifically said you would be surprised how quickly the impossible in the political realm can become the inevitable.
Thanks, Ted. I'll take two more questions. So, gentleman in the middle there and the lady behind.
Matthew Carr from Bloomberg News. So, Policy Exchange generally is a pro-free market sort of organisation, right? So, why is it that you're recommending a tax? Because wouldn't an ETS inspire the entrepreneurial spirit and allow people to make money cutting emissions, and so allow a much faster pace of emission cuts?
And just behind you.
Eva Waitman from International Emissions Trading Association, to disclose myself. Similarly, with the question of Matthew, I welcome the discussion, which I think is very good. It is good to have this fresh look. Our members, we are a member organization. They come from US, Canada, Europe. They have they all express their opinion that they promote and support carbon pricing because it gives them the flexibility. They may agree that it's not has not been a perfect market, but it's one that has been working. I would probably slightly disagree that it hasn't promoted investment. It has, maybe not to the degree that we would like it to see, but we have a lot of examples among our membership where it has promoted investments. Part of it is the whole Talanoa dialogue within the UNFCCC. So I think my question is, do you think this system is the best system for a sophisticated market as the UK? What I'm taking from the discussion is not necessarily one or the other fits all. Is UK the right place? Is my question.
Thanks. Well, I'll just quickly respond to that and say you should read Dieter Helm's report from 2010, which is a critique of emissions trading schemes, and one of them is it promotes, his words, not mine, rent-seeking vultures who can make money out of sort of playing the system. And there's even been cases of money laundering alleged through the emissions trading scheme. But I think a tax or a trading scheme, they're both in this context a free market solution. You said put a price on carbon and you let the market work.
Can I address that? Yeah, I want to disagree with my friend from Bloomberg that a tax in this case is not a free market conservative solution. It is widely acknowledged in the economic field that what we have here is an externality, meaning a market failure. Hence, this would be a corrective tax. If you look at the brain power in the economic field that is aligning behind this, I mean, the most respected conservative economists, three former secretaries of Treasury, now our new Nobel laureate today. I mean, there is widespread consensus in the economic field that the tax route is the most elegant and cost-effective. It is a free market solution. Regarding the trade-off between tax and ETS, I mean, one thing I just want to point out is that the distinction is blurring, because in the context of our carbon tax proposal, we're suggesting a emissions assurance mechanism, which is basically a backstop to ensure that emissions reductions are met. In the case of the ETS models, as here in the UK, there has been a price floor. So, I mean, these vehicles are moving closer together as opposed to being sort of the A versus B.
Michael?
Yeah, I think this can get a bit techy, but it is really important. We very much agreed that a major challenge of carbon pricing is politics. And to a large degree, it was politics that led us to start with emissions trading. Because, in part, the free allowances meant you could give the heavy industries that would otherwise block it an allowance, and it meant you could bring a trading community on board and have a constituency which would support the thing. And it chimed better, if you like, with the mood music of the 90s about trading mechanisms, etc., etc. Does that mean that entirely should always hold? Well, I think, like many things, it's a question of how mature has the society got. I think in the UK, there's sufficient political consensus that we've got really serious about taxation, and we probably couldn't politically do it. Still doesn't mean it would be easier. There would be a lot of squawking. Suddenly you are really extracting all of the revenue from emitters and taking it somewhere else, and they would not like that, particularly those that currently have free allowances or are exempt from the scheme. The other argument, which I think has not enough attention, is we're dealing with a lot of different kinds of decisions by a lot of different kinds of decision makers. And people in the operational market will handle prices and carbon pricing very clear, very unambiguous. For some of the more strategic views, people need a sense of where is this beast going. And in that sense, I think there's also been maturity that you have an emissions insurance mechanism. The proposal here is anchored in the Climate Change Act and budgets. I've been supervising a PhD which says actually carbon pricing is really most effective if it is based within a budget system, carbon budget system, so that industry knows where the quantities are going as well as the price. And basically, in Europe we have the Market Stability Reserve, which is a kind of quantity corridor within a quantity mechanism, but has something approaching the impact of a price corridor. I think there's a lot of economic and political judgments that lead you to either a tax that varies according to the objective or a cap that varies according to the price levels achieved. And those hybrid mechanisms, I actually think they sound messy, but I think they're exactly where we need to go.
Anything quick, Alyssa, if you
Yeah,
can?
maybe a couple of quick things to pick up on there. I liked Michael's use of the term mood music, because I think that mood music is what determined us going towards an ETS in the first place. One of the things I hear in this proposal that chimes with current mood music, I think, is this dividend that tackles social inequality. And I think we cannot underestimate that, being aware of what the current mood music is. That's been very damaging, actually, to some of what we're trying to do in climate here. When you hear the conversations about perhaps the electricity price that individuals see, why is that so loud and why is that so problematic? That's because of what we see around inequality. And so I think responding to political mood music is actually really, really important. You actually said, is the UK the right place to move to a tax? Would we lose something of the sophistication because the UK is so sophisticated? I think the most important thing is that if you go towards this policy, you mustn't go backwards, right? So if you were to set a carbon tax level that was below the current ETS price, which is strengthening, that would be a disaster. If you were to do one that was just not acknowledging some of these other non-price barriers, and this proposal acknowledges some of them, but perhaps not all, then you would also be losing that sophisticated understanding. So some of those technical things that Michael mentions are a vital part of learning from the past if we're going to go down this route.
Yeah, I'll take just two more. We started a little late, so I'll run over a little bit. One at the front here, and the gentleman on the far side.
Thank you. I'm Ed Atkinson from the Citizens Climate Lobby. Both my questions are to Ted. How important has the Citizens Climate Lobby been for you as a completely non-partisan organisation? Like saying to politicians, look, we'll cover your backs, we'll support you, and not being associated with just one side of the divide, which you seem in danger of being, certainly in America. And the second question is there any way you can design your policy to make it easy for other economies to join the club?
Sure, I will take the last question, the gentleman here on the left.
Hi, Luke Clark from Renewable UK. I just want to talk about technology substitution, I suppose.
And a question quite quickly, if you're...
Sorry, yes, no, there is a question, I promise. So just in terms of speaking to a colleague in the Polish Wind Energy Association, at the moment the carbon price is rising. They don't have low carbon alternatives that they can switch to easily. So obviously there's a lag there and costs being built in. So my question is, and recognising Lord Darling's point that energy isn't a sort of normal market, does a carbon price, in a sense, does it lessen the pressure on government to make choices about technology development and what's going to be supported because, hey, there's a price here that can do that? Or does it, in a sense, actually increase the pressure on government to make those choices because the longer you leave those choices, the more cost is escalating where you don't have a substitute technology?
Thanks, great question. And I think you can touch on that. Ted, I'll let you answer the two questions, and then we can...
Sure. Citizens Climate Lobby has been a very effective force in American politics, but I think your characterization of the political optics are a little too simplistic. So I had the pleasure to speak at the annual meeting of CCL in Washington, and I asked a question. I said, please raise your hand if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Most of the hands went up and they were Democrat. I said, okay, let me pose it a new way. Let me define a climate conservative as one who believes that a market price is a more cost-effective way to solve climate change than regulation. And then I asked, who in the room is a climate conservative, and it turns out that more than 2/3 of the hands went up. So I think the politics are a little blurred, and certainly what we want in the United States is ultimately a grand bipartisan bargain, but we are starting with a conservative plan, that is correct. As to the other countries, we haven't talked that much about a BCA, but simply put, if one country or region were to lead with this, other countries you'd quickly align. Say if America went, Europe and Canada, say, would align, you'd end up with a carbon club with an external border carbon adjustment. It would start a domino effect. And just very quickly, I mean, the revolutionary nature here is that if you go back to Kyoto originally, it was about getting every country on the same, sort of at the same table, right? I'm sorry, on the same piece of paper. That did not work. You go to Paris, everybody comes to the same table with their own piece of paper. That worked a bit better. A whole different strategy here. Unilateral action with border carbon adjustments, domino effect, very different theory of change.
Okay, so we'll take final comments from Alyssa and Michael. I think both of you touched on the idea that you need extra things if you're going to decarbonize heat and things like this. So Alyssa?
Yeah, I think, you reflected very much, I hope what came through with some of my comments, that for a carbon price to be effective, it has to be possible for people to make those choices. And that will continue to mean that we need some government investment in infrastructure and so on. That will be different in different places, and decisions about whether they want to invest or back one technology or another will be different. So for example, in the UK, backing offshore wind makes sense also, because then we've got lots of offshore locations, and then we can create an industry, which we have. So there definitely, it doesn't let government off the hook completely. We still need to see this combined action, government, business, citizens.
Michael, final thoughts?
Just on that last question particularly, innovation is a long and complicated process. Carbon prices would effectively, the more you are towards the mature end of that process, the more influence it will have. The stronger the carbon price, the more durable, the more foresight there is, the more it would enable the governments to step away from involvement in the latter stages of that process. But some other things can help, and one of the others I'd just mention is, I think in the electricity sector, the next stage of what we've got would need or benefit from facilitating direct contracts between renewables and, if you like, pools of industrial business consumers to buy zero carbon electricity. One of the major incentives for them to sign such contracts, so purely private market or possibly with a regulated pool in the middle, as we used to have in the power sector, one of the major incentives for people to sign those contracts would be if the rest of the electricity system was facing a rising carbon price. And in that way you can see how it could play a crucial role in shifting effectively private processes towards low carbon investments that match the consumers and suppliers.
Sure. Ted, any final quick comment from you? No, we're good. Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and thanks particularly to Lord Darling and Lord Howard for their opening remarks. And can you thank our panelists, please?